When my older son Silas was 8 years old in the summer of 2011, I took him along with a Little League All-Star baseball team that I was coaching to Swift Current for a tournament. And we were in the third game of the tournament late on Saturday afternoon. Silas was playing third base. My group of kids were pretty young for this tournament. Most of them were 8 to 9 years old. Most of the kids that we were playing were 10. Some were actually 11 years old, and these were big farm kids from Saskatchewan that we were playing. We hadn't had a whole lot of luck so far, but we were digging in deep, trying to make a good showing as best we could, represent the hat. Silas was playing third base in this game, and big kid, moose of a kid, comes up to the plate, and he rips a ground ball down the third base line towards Silas. Now, I'm on the third base dugout, and I can kind of see the play happening. It looks like the ball, as hard as it's hit, is going to skirt between where Silas is positioned at third base and where the shortstop is positioned to his left. Silas took about a half step to his left in response or in reaction to the ball. Just as the ball got to his side and should have skirted into the outfield, it hit the shale, and the spin on the ball caused it to kick up right back into his face. He fell flat down on the ground and on his face. I was in the dugout, and I couldn't see exactly where it hit him. The third base umpire called time, and you could hear a pin drop. Everybody got so silent as Silas lay there in the dirt on his face. I ran out of the dugout over to him, and I wasn't exactly sure where the ball had hit him, but as I rolled him over onto his back and he faced me, I could see clearly that the ball had hit him square in the eye. In fact, it was already swollen completely shut. It was pretty tasty looking, wasn't it? Now, as I was sitting there with Silas, I could see that he was clearly hurt. He was scared as much as he was hurt. After we panicked there on the field for just a moment, we got him off to the side. We started to put an ice pack on it, realizing this was a big deal. And a nurse came up the hill, took a look at it, and encouraged us to quickly get to the emergency room because the doctor was going to need to actually see his eyeball before the swelling got so bad that he couldn't get in there. It was already swollen pretty badly. In fact, it was puffed up so much that in the car on the way to the hospital, Ephraim, Silas's little brother, who was 6 years old at the time, was worried about how we were going to get the ball out of his eye because it was swollen up that big. Elizabeth hadn't actually traveled to that tournament with us, so it was another mom who took Silas and me and Ephraim over to the hospital. We got in, they did an x-ray, a couple of x-rays, and then they put us in the room to wait for the attending physician. And the whole while, I can see that Silas he's probably more frightened than he was hurt. I mean, certainly it hurt, but his eye was kind of numb. He wasn't feeling a whole lot of pain, but he was terrified. He was afraid of what was happening. It had happened so fast, and people were making such a big deal about his eye that he was afraid of what was going to happen. All I could do as his dad was just hold him. All I could do was just wrap my arms around him and hold him and reassure him that everything was going to be okay, in spite of the fact that I wasn't 100% sure that everything was going to be okay. I was pretty worried myself. The attending physician came in, and it got more complicated because when you're a little kid, you go see the doctor. You go to see the doctor to make you better, right? This doctor came in and needed to see Silas's eyeball. And so I can see the terror, the fear, the pain in Silas's face, and I'm holding him, and I'm trying to encourage him and reassure him. And the doctor now all of a sudden starts trying to pry his eyelids apart to see the eye. And so now I see the concern in Silas's face as to why this doctor, who's supposed to be making him feel better, is actually making it feel so much worse. And again, all I could do as a dad in that situation was just wrap my arms around him, hold him, and do everything that I could to give him that reassuring touch, to let him know that Daddy was there and everything was going to be okay. You know, all of us probably can think back to times when we were younger, when we hurt ourselves. Maybe you fell off your bike and skinned your knee, or you fell off the swing set and banged yourself up pretty good. And maybe you had somebody, like a mom or dad or an aunt or uncle or a grandma or grandpa, or even maybe an older sibling who was there to wrap their arms around you and to do whatever they could to make the hurt go away. There was really nothing they could do to make the hurt go away, but they tried by just touching you and holding you and comforting you to reinforce the fact that you were loved and that somebody cared for you. I remember as a kid, when I scraped my knee, my mom, or an elbow or something, my mom would put camphor oil on the wound as an antiseptic. Any of you ever have camphor oil put on something? it stings like nobody's business. Like it burns. And so it's this kind of this complicated thing with my mom, because she wanted to make it better, but she knew it was going to hurt. So she'd be there to put the camphor oil on and then blow, right? Because blowing on it makes it feel better. And I have those memories of my mom doing that for me. We long when we are injured or hurt or sick, we long for a healing touch. When you go to a hospital and you visit someone who's sick or going through a tough time, you want to hold their hand. You want to touch them, to reassure them, to help them feel better. And we all long for that when we're not well. We long for somebody to wrap their arms around us, to touch us, to reassure us. So far as we've ventured through the healing miracles that Jesus performed in the first few chapters of the Gospel of Mark, one thing has been consistent is that in each of the miracles Jesus performed, he just spoke them to happen. With the leper and the paralyzed man, the man with the deformed hand, the man with the edema, Jesus simply said, "You're healed," and they were healed. He just spoke it. Today we're going to actually look at a story that demonstrates the power of the touch. We've seen a couple of stories already that highlight the desperation that people had in needing to experience the life change that Jesus offers. We looked at the man with leprosy in the first chapter of Mark. We looked at a man who was paralyzed in the second chapter of Mark. Both of these men had reached a dead end in their lives. There was nothing that they could do to solve their own problem, to fix themselves. And so they desperately came to Jesus longing for life change. Today we're going to look at the story of a woman who had literally tried everything to solve her own problem. But in taking measures into her own hands and doing all that she knew how to do, she actually made her own condition worse. She reached a place where she had no more options. There was nothing left for her to do or try to experience life change, to experience healing, until she had a life-changing experience, a physical encounter with Jesus himself. Now, when we last left Jesus, he and his disciples had sailed on a boat to the Gerasenes region, trying to find some reprieve from all the craziness and busyness that was going on in their ministry. They'd been traveling from town to town. Big crowds had been following them. There was a big push for people to get in and see Jesus and hear Jesus. And so they'd sailed to the Gerasenes region, where there wasn't a big crowd there waiting for them, but there was a demon-possessed man. That was the story we looked at last week. The man had thousands of demons in him. And Jesus, as Jesus tends to always do, he healed the man. He exorcised those demons from that man. But the people of that region were so frightened by the power that Jesus demonstrated in that healing that they asked Jesus to leave. They didn't want him to be around. It frightened them as opposed to giving them hope and encouragement. We're going to pick up our text this morning in Mark chapter 5, beginning at verse 21. It says, Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. This was exactly what they were trying to get away from, were the big crowds. And they sail back, and sure enough, there's another crowd there. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. "My little daughter is dying," he said. "Please come and lay your hands on her. Heal her so she can live." Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She'd suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years, she'd spent everything she had to pay them, but she had gotten no better. In fact, she'd gotten worse. Now, this is an interesting story. Both Mark and Luke record this account in their Gospels. What's interesting to me is that both of them start by recounting the approach by Jairus to Jesus asking for healing for his daughter, and then both of them actually interrupt that story to tell the story of this bleeding woman, this woman who was very sick, who approached Jesus in the middle of the street. Now, this woman has a very serious health condition. In all likelihood, it's probably a uterine hemorrhage of some sort. And she's been suffering from this condition for at least 12 years. There are a few important things that we can extrapolate from this brief description that Mark gives us about her condition. The first is this: she's quite sick. She has been bleeding for 12 years. So you might imagine that her body is anemic, that she's got other health problems that kind of go along with the anemia. We also know from the text that the treatment that she's been receiving from doctors has actually made her condition worse. You might imagine what first century medicine looked like. It was quack science at best. I read a few commentaries this week that talked about the types of things that doctors would have prescribed for people with this type of condition to try to get them to heal them. And they would have used all kinds of natural path and natural aids to solve the problem. But in doing so, the text tells us that she'd actually suffered under the doctor's care, and it had made her condition worse. So as she approaches Jesus, she's very, very sick. The second thing is she's broke. She's flat busted. Mark tells us that she'd spent all that she had trying to find cures from doctors. Now, this would infer to us that at some point she had some money, because people in the first century didn't go see doctors unless they were people of some wealth. So at some point in time in her life, she was pretty well off. And so she used the money that she had to seek medical attention to try to cure this 12-year problem that she had. But she spent everything. And so now, in addition to being sick, she's financially destitute as well. The third thing that we know is true from this brief description is that she's all alone. She's completely alone. Under the law of Moses, under the law that God gave to Moses, when a woman was menstruating, she was considered to be ceremonially unclean. And that meant for 1 week of the month, a woman was not permitted to worship in the synagogue. No one was to dine with her, to come into physical contact with her. Her husband would not share a bed with her. No one was to sit in a chair that she had sat in. If they came into any contact with her or anything she touched, they would be considered ceremonial unclean as well. They wouldn't be able to worship, and so they had to go through all kinds of rituals and hoopla to get themselves restored. And so basically, for 1 week of every month, a woman during the first century under the law of Moses was a shut-in. She was basically isolated, stuck in her home, and could not have any physical contact with anyone else in her community, including her own family. This woman has been experiencing this condition for 12 years. We don't know how old she is. We don't know whether or not she was married or not. Had she been married at some point, it's likely that her husband would have divorced her because he would not have been able to live with her and remain ceremonially clean. He would have been in perpetual trouble and because of his contact with her. So they would have had no life together, and he would have in all likelihood divorced her. It's likely that she doesn't have any children. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't her fault, but it was her reality. You can imagine for 12 years, more than 4,000 days, she'd not had any physical contact with another human being. No hugs, no pat on the back. She hadn't shared meals with anyone. If she was married, she hadn't shared a bed with her husband. She couldn't have had her hair braided by her big sister or her little sister. She couldn't have played on the playground with her nieces or nephews. Nothing. No physical contact for 4,000 plus days. Unlike lepers during these days, lepers had their own communities outside the city limits. And so they could interact with one another. There was like a community for those people. This woman had no community, nothing whatsoever. She was basically a prisoner in her own home. Her situation was completely hopeless. We'll continue reading the text. Verse 27, it says, she'd heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. Immediately, the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Now, the first verse of this passage, verse 27 that we just read, says a lot to me about how we experience life change from Jesus, how that starts, what instigates real life change. It says that this woman who's lonely, poor, sick, and isolated, and hopeless had heard about Jesus. This indicates to me that someone in her life had told her about Jesus. Someone had communicated something to her. And whatever it was that someone told her, that had planted a seed. And that seed had sprouted into faith. It gave her some kind of hope. Romans 10:17, Paul writes to the church in Rome, he explains that faith comes by hearing the good news of Jesus. Faith comes from hearing. Now, there's an oft-quoted saying, it's attributed to St. Francis Assisi, but I don't think it was really him. But the saying goes, preach the gospel always, and if necessary, use words. You might have heard that before. Now, I'm not a big fan of that saying, and I'll tell you why. Because although many sincere Christians will say that your role in life as an evangelist, someone who should be sharing your faith, is to go around and live your life exuding the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit, when the Holy Spirit's in you, produces things like love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness. And if you just live your life in a way that shows people those things, that people will come to know Jesus. They will get to know him just like you do. But I'll be honest with you. It really doesn't matter how joyfully I mow my lawn. That does not help my neighbor understand the relationship that God wants to have with him through Jesus. Does it? Doesn't really explain that very well. If you choose to give the good parking space at Walmart to somebody else and you choose to park farther away and walk the extra 50 feet because you want to do a good deed, you want to be kind to someone, that does not give them the slightest clue as to how they can have a restored relationship with God, does it? Faith comes by hearing. The only way that somebody can come to faith in Jesus is by hearing about Jesus. The gospel means the good news. News means that there was an event that took place 2,000 years ago. Kind of goes like this. Jesus came to earth, God in human form, lived a perfect, sinless life, laid down his life, was executed, killed on a cross. 3 days later, he came back to life. He defeated death, and now he lives today sitting at the right hand of God the Father in heaven. That's the news. It was an actual event that took place. He did that so that we could all overcome spiritual death and have a restored relationship with God the Father ourselves. And it's news. And because it's news, it has to be told. It has to be spoken. If you don't understand what I'm saying here, I want you to go home this afternoon, dial up the chat news on your TV, and watch it with your television muted, and see how much you actually get. You might pick up little bits and details, maybe some of the graphics on the screen or some video clips will clue you into a few things, but you're by and large gonna miss the most important parts of the news because you're not hearing the news. Jesus said that those who are his followers, his disciples, are to be witnesses to the world. And what does a witness do? Well, a witness comes to the courtroom, sits on the witness stand, and then they tell what they know. They speak words to recount an event that took place, something they experienced, something they saw, something they know to be true. That's what a witness does. And it's obvious that at some point in time, this woman had someone witness something that Jesus had done, and then she reported that good news to this sick woman. And that good news planted in her heart sparked faith, which gave her hope that she could have some sort of cure, that she could experience life change, that Jesus could do something for her that no one else had been able to do for her. The hope that she had sparked action. And what was that action? The action was she got off her butt and she went and she found Jesus. She pursued him. She got close to him, and then she reached out and she touched him. The word in the Greek that's in our Bible here for touched actually has more action to it than just touching. It really infers that she grabbed or she grasped his robe. She gave it a good yank. Let's just put it that way. Okay? It would be pretty naive for us to think that we could experience real life change from Jesus simply by rubbing shoulders with Jesus, or simply by giving Jesus a little high five every once in a while, a little knuckle bump. Jesus, you're my homeboy, right? That's not how we're going to experience real life change. If you want to experience real life change, you've got to get close, you've got to reach out, and you've got to grab him, and you've got to hang on like your life depends on it. Because in all actuality, your life does depend on it. So this woman touched Jesus. She grabbed his garment, and she was immediately healed. Now, let's picture what's happening here. Jesus and his disciples, his posse, they have just gotten off the boat. They show up. They were trying to get away from the crowds, but they can't get away from the crowds. They get off the boat, and there's a big crowd there. And everybody's wanting to get close. Everybody's wanting to touch Jesus. Then this guy named Jairus, who's the local leader of the synagogue, is kind of the leader of the local church. He shows up, he busts through the crowd and he says, Jesus, my daughter is dying. Will you please come and touch my daughter and heal her? You can keep her from dying. Jesus says, sure. So Jairus begins leading Jesus and the disciples through the village streets to his home, and the crowd is pressing in, and it's absolute chaos. You can picture Jairus pushing people out of the way, trying to get Jesus to his home as quickly as he can. Meanwhile, our sick woman, our bleeding woman, she shows up, and she knows she can't be identified because everybody in her community would know that she's unclean. So she covers her head with some sort of cloak, and she makes her way into the crowd. Maybe she's down on her hands and her knees and she's crawling towards Jesus, doing everything she can to get close to him. She's getting stepped on. She's being kicked. And finally she gets close enough to reach out and grab the hem of his garment. And Jesus stops. And the whole crowd stops. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him. So he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said to him, "Look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over." Now, what's interesting about this is that this is not the first time that someone has touched Jesus and been healed. In fact, in Luke chapter 6, Luke talks about the big crowds coming around Jesus and everyone putting their hands on Jesus and Jesus' power leaving him. And Luke writes that everyone who touched Jesus was healed. What's different about this story is that Jesus stops to make a point. He stops to identify the woman. Now, at first glance, it looks like he's kind of mad, doesn't it? Hey, who touched me? Who took healing without permission? Right? It looks like he's kind of irritated. And she's frightened. Obviously, it scared her. She maybe thought that she was going to be in trouble because she just made him ceremonially unclean by touching him. Not to mention the fact that everyone that she probably touched and had an encounter with while she was pushing through that crowd to get through Jesus was now ceremonially unclean. She just created quite a mess. She'd taken healing without asking permission. Maybe she was in trouble. But instead, what we see here is Jesus creating for us the perfect picture for salvation. It starts with us approaching Jesus with a desire to be changed, to be healed. We've got to approach him. We talk about this all the time here at Grasslands. We say that our first step in experiencing life change is to repent, which means to change our direction. We change our direction, aiming our lives, reorienting our lives towards Jesus. And then we reach out and we grab him in faith, just like this woman did, expectant of his power and his ability to restore us, to implement the life change, to cleanse us. And it's that act of faith that makes us clean. Just like it was the act of faith that made this bleeding woman healed. It made her clean. She was healed. She was no longer ceremonially unclean. Now she could worship. Now she could share a meal with her neighbors. Now she could hang around with her family and spend time with them. Now maybe she could get married. Maybe she could have a family. She could get hugs again. 12 years without physical contact with another human being. And now she's been restored. And she was restored because she had a full-on grasp of Jesus. And in order for us to experience life change, we've all got to have a full grasp of who Jesus is and the message of the gospel. Then, Jesus calls her to a moment of public confession. In the city street, amongst the whole crowd, the whole mob, all the disciples, all the people who knew who this woman was and what her condition was, Jesus had her tell her story. And so she recounted the whole situation. She had this condition for 12 years. She tried seeing doctor after doctor. Nobody had been able to cure her. She was poor. She was destitute. She was lonely, and she was discouraged. She was desperate. but she so wanted to believe that Jesus could heal her. And he did. The moment I touched your garment, I knew my body was healed. You fixed me. You changed me in ways that I could never fix myself. You fixed me. You changed me in ways that no one else could ever do for me. Jesus called her to make this public confession, not because he felt that she owed it to him, but because it was a moment like this that she had to decide who Jesus was going to be in her life. He knew that whatever was going to come out of her mouth was rooted in her heart. When we're willing to confess publicly who Jesus is to us and what he's done to change us, it has a lot of power in our lives. In fact, it does a couple of things for us specifically. One, it solidifies what is really in our heart about who Jesus is and what he means to us. Many of us live out our lives kind of with our faith private. It's a personal faith. We don't talk a whole lot about it. But when we learn to verbalize who Jesus is to us and the change that he's made in our lives, it helps root that truth in our hearts. The second thing it does is it helps others see him more clearly. And it helps them pursue him so that they can experience the life change that we've experienced. It's in those moments that we verbalize what Jesus has done for us and who he is to us that we become witnesses, like witnesses on the stand, telling his story, telling the good news.
I'm going to read you my story. I'm so blessed to have a wonderful son, Shane, and great family and friends. They have supported me through good times and bad.
You'll get through it.
I know. I started going to church early in life and off and on and growing up. And when I had Shane, I went to the Westminster United Church in Medicine Hat. I stopped going for many reasons. My divorce for one. I did not feel good enough at the time, and I had lost all hope of being forgiven for my sins. I gave up on myself. I hurt a lot of people with my actions. I even hurt myself. I had a heart attack and I nearly lost my life in 2006. God gave me a second chance. My family and friends tried to get me to attend Grasslands Church for at least the last 2 years, right? God, tears in my eyes, I can't read. One day I did go. I listened to Pastor Bart had to say, and I enjoyed his teachings and the music. And yes, I did go back. I kept on going back, and I felt like I was missing something in my life. And I wanted to have a relationship with Jesus. I wanted to give my life to him. I then started a discovery group with Norm and Linda. I truly believe after attending this group that God loves me and wants a relationship with me, and this is truly amazing. And I want one with him. I believe that there is more to it than just praying daily. You have to open your heart and trust and have faith in Jesus. The reason I chose to be baptized at this time in my life was because I want to follow and build a relationship with him and someday go to heaven. And I want to continue my life journey, my new beginnings, and a better life following him. This is truly the best time of my life, surrounded by family and friends, and for me to take the next step. I am very blessed, and I thank all of you for being here for me on this amazing faith journey. I cannot thank you each enough. That's all I've written.
Kim, do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God?
Yes.
Have you received him as your Savior?
Yes.
And how long do you intend to follow him?
Forever.
Based on your profession of faith, your friends are now going to baptize you in the name of the Father, and the Son,
Good Lord.
and the Holy Spirit. It happened to be minus 20 on Friday night. It's a nice, warm, hot tub. You heard her say, I'm not getting out. The rest of us were standing in the snow, shivering. That is a public confession. That is being a witness. That's what Jesus calls us to do. When we've placed our faith in him, he wants us to tell people about what he's done in our lives. He wants us to tell others about our decision to follow him. That's why I think Jesus called this woman to her public confession on the street that day. Now, before turning his attention back to Jairus and going and healing his daughter, Jesus made one final comment to this woman right there at the end of the passage that we read. It says, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over." This is the only time anywhere in the Gospels that we see Jesus refer to someone as daughter. It leads me to believe that Jesus used that term, that terminology, that term of endearment, because he was fully aware of just how isolated this woman had been for all those years. She needed to be comforted, reassured, someone who was willing to wrap their arms around her like a daddy does to a daughter. Those of you who are fathers of daughters, you know just how amazing that feeling is to hold your little girl, your little princess. And this woman had not been anyone's princess for a very, very long time. You know, Jairus' daughter had a daddy who was willing to go and find Jesus, risk his career. He worked for the Pharisees. The Pharisees were not fans of Jesus, but he was going to go find Jesus and see if he could get his daughter healed. My son Silas had a daddy who was willing to do whatever it took to get his eye fixed, to reassure him, to help him feel comfortable in a time where he was going through a lot of pain and a lot of fear. You know, you might have been blessed with a mommy or a daddy who was willing to bandage your wounds, to blow on your owies, to do whatever it took to make you feel loved, to make you feel better. Maybe it wasn't a mommy or daddy. Maybe it was a grandma or a grandpa or an aunt or uncle or maybe an older brother or sister. This woman, she had no one. But Jesus reassured her that she did have someone who was willing to be there for her every step of the way. He would fix the hurt. He would heal the wound. He would hold her when she needed to be held. And this may in some way describe sort of a place that you find yourself in your life. Maybe you look in the mirror and you see someone who, for all intents and purposes, is just damaged goods. You've lost your self-worth. You don't feel valuable to anyone. You hurt. You're lonely. You're desperate for change. And you don't know that there's anyone who can fix you. But no matter what you're going through, no matter what the circumstances are that you're experiencing, there is a touch that changes everything. We've got to grab hold of Jesus and hold on tight. Hold on like nothing else matters. It doesn't mean that there won't be tough times. It doesn't mean that we won't go through challenging experiences in our life. In fact, those are pretty much guaranteed. There will be troubles in this world. We've all experienced them, and we will all experience more. But what it does mean, what God guarantees, is that regardless of those troubles, regardless of those valleys, regardless of those low points in our lives, he is there with us. He will always be there to walk those long, dark, and lonely roads with you. The 23rd Psalm, the psalmist writes, "Even when I walk through the darkest valley," some translations say, "the valley of the shadow of death." What a terrible place to be. But some of you have been there. Some of you are there right now in the valley of the shadow of death, the dark valley. The writer says, "I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me." How do I know he's close beside me? Well, he's promised that he would be. But even if I didn't have that promise, I know he's close beside me because I've got hold of him. And I am not letting go.